welcome back to ELS Discourse. This is the second part of episode 2. We have with us Professor Akash Singh Rathore, and we are discussing Preamble, Ambedkar, and philosophical foundations of the Preamble. If you haven't watched the first part, click on the link in the description below. So we'll divert a bit from the book. This is with respect to a debate in Constituent Assembly. An amendment was moved by H.V. Kamath to introduce the words "in the name of God" at the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution, before the words "we the people of India." Then, after rounds of debate and discussions, the amendment was ultimately rejected. So, can we reasonably presume and interpret from this episode that secularism was impliedly accepted by the Constituent Assembly and there's no particular need for the 42nd Amendment? That is a later question, that whether it was a need for the 42nd Amendment or not, but we can reasonably interpret that secularism was impliedly an inherent part of the Constitution of India, and as this is one of your books that you have edited, Indian Political Thought. Romila Thapar has authored an essay in that. The title is Secularism Alien to India?
Yeah.
So a thread can connect all the dots, and we can reasonably presume that this is something that India stands for as a whole. There's no doubt about it.
Yes, I mean, so this is, you ask very complicated questions. This is a very complicated issue. Let's break it up.
Sir, sorry to interrupt. I've just read whatever you have written, and everything I'm asking is from your writings only.
Touche, you've thrown it back at me. So let's divide this into three parts, and I'll try to be brief on the parts. So the one part is historical, by bringing in what Professor Romila has to say. The second part is technical, and that's something I'll explain in a moment. And then the third part is, in a way, the implications that you were speaking of. Can we see secularism as being implied? So starting with the first part, this debate about whether secularism is alien to Indian civilization is, of course, Romila's answer or counter argument against Ashish Nandi and T.N. Madan, and several others, of course, who say that that secularism is a foreign or an alien concept. Now, Romila's argument, which I think is the right argument, probably why I included the essay in the book, is that Ashish Nandi is partly right and partly wrong. He's right because, as his claim is that the various Indic traditions have religious resources internal to the history of those traditions themselves to be the functional equivalent to what the West referred to as secularism when it imported it and imposed it in India. And in fact, if the West had not imposed secularism in India, then we would have seen less communal violence, because the communal violence is largely a response to the imposition of alien and modern ideas, just as, for example, Amartya Sen had argued that famines were largely a result of British presence in India. So, you know, a British presence being often justified on the basis of our poverty and tendency to have famines. Sen argues, no, it's the other way around. So Nandi says, forget about secularism, because for two reasons. We have a functional equivalent internal to our religious traditions. And since internal to our religious traditions, we have this functional equivalent, we would always prefer to stay true to our internal traditions than to worship the imports. Now, Romila's argument is so yes, Nandi is exactly right that various Indic traditions, religious traditions, as well as philosophical traditions, have internal resources that are functionally equivalent and in fact superior to certain foreign models of secularism. But where Nandi and Madan are wrong is to play this game that just using the word secularism is in some way dangerous. Words have contexts in order to have meaning. You don't just go from words to meaning, you go through context into meaning. And since the context within India are those very internal and past resources, any Indian citizen can simply understand by secularism not the British's definition and demarcation of what it means, but his or her own traditional encounters and experiences with practices that are functionally equivalent to secularism. So I side with Romila very much on this issue, because while Nandi is right, I think, in the first aspect, that Indic traditions have functional equivalence, he's wrong in the second to say that therefore it is dangerous for us to use the word secularism. It's just a word. So that's the first part of it. And Dr. Ambedkar is fairly clear about this as well, because in each of the concepts that he is interested in amplifying and championing, he traces them back generally to Buddhist traditions. So he always wants to have an indigenous functional equivalent to the concepts or principles that vitalize the Constitution. So I think Ambedkar also would agree with Romila Thapra's argument. So why didn't he just put the word secularism in the preamble then? Because he was asked many, many times in very animated ways by Shah and others, please include socialist and secularists. And of course, as I had mentioned, States and Minorities was a state socialist constitution that Dr. Ambedkar had drafted. And so why did he refuse to use the words socialist and secular in the preamble itself when Shah and others were demanding it? So here we come to the technical reason. Now, this is something that I'm afraid I'm a lone voice on, is throughout all of India. And a good friend of mine and mentor, Neera Chandok, one of India's top political theorists, she always gets angry with me because she disagrees, but I'm definitely right. And, and it's this point, that the word secularism, literally the word secularism, did not appear in any preamble to any constitution when the Indian constitution was drafted. Now, Neera says that, well, obviously Ataturk's, the Turkish constitutions, Ataturk had written two constitutions, I believe, in the 1920s, one in 21 and one in 24. I might be wrong about these dates. I'm going from memory. And so Neera says that Ataturk, who was a champion of secularism in Turkey, secularizing Turkey, changing the script from Arabic to Latin and all of these so-called westernized maneuvers, she said India had Ataturk's model. So, and that was a secular constitution. Now, the problem is that was a secular constitution, but secularism is in Article 1. It is not in the preamble of the Turkish constitution. And there was no preamble in the world that had the word secular in it. And now, why is this significant? If you actually look at how B.N. Rao was drafting the draft that was to be handed over to the drafting committee for working on, he was very specific about precedents. So in the Indian Constitution and preamble should not just, because we're excited about being a new republic, should not just create all sorts of newfangled concepts and ideas. We have to learn from the 200 years or 100 years of previous democracies, Poland, France, the United States. And so the drafting committee was quite decisive on this issue, that we are not going to introduce terms where they have never appeared before in other constitutions. This was a merely technical thing, and I'm very much alone on arguing this point. Other people think it's not significant, but I assure you, imagine you have the burden of framing the Constitution for Free India on your shoulders, and you need some anchor. And the anchor that the drafting committee had were pre-existing constitutions and the ways that words traveled through them. And then we come to the third point. Does that mean that secularism can only be inferred from the Constitution? Or you phrased it stronger. Since there was an invocation of God, now this relates to the question of sovereignty. All, for example, the Organization of Islamic Countries have Allah as the source of sovereignty. India has the people as the source of sovereignty. And then various other constitutions around the world will include some kind of designation that sovereignty lies in the people, but it is under the stewardship of God. For example, like the Irish Constitution. So what we get is a constant negotiation of what role does God have to play in a secular republic's constitution. The drafting committee was very decisive that there would be no invocation to a higher power in the Indian constitution, that sovereignty lay with the people of India. And this would not be confused by bringing any invocation to God, Parameshwar, and Gandhi, who were the three main competitors for being invoked in our preamble. So the refusal to invoke God or God-men like Gandhi in the preamble can serve as a ground for inferring secularism. This is what you had phrased. Now, that is very true, but it's not something that we merely need to infer, because Dr. Ambedkar himself in the Open Assembly said that this is a secular constitution, as you can see by the numerous clauses. In fact, he said this is a secular and socialist constitution, as you can see from numerous clauses. And then he pointed in particular to what became the directive principles of state policy, which are, of course, where we find the majority of our socialist and secular clauses. So sorry, I gave you a long history, but that's a complex and it's kind of it's a very debated topic. Did we need the 42nd Amendment? Look, that's the era of emergency. You know, I think if we could wipe that whole couple of years out of our history, it might be something very healing for us. I particularly find offensive, I don't know if I want to say this at risk of being arrested, so let me phrase it softer. I find particularly superfluous and possibly dangerous that we added integrity to the word unity of the nation, unity and integrity of the nation. Because that term has been exploited for so much violence on the part of the state, on the side of the state. And the function of this preamble, the spirit of the preamble, is we the people. I mean, that's really what this preamble is about. We the people and our aspirations and our finally getting the opportunity to pursue freedom and flourish as a community. And what do they write in? They write in that not so fast, it's going to be on our terms. And if we say that what you're doing is dangerous, then that's it. That's it for you. So I find that a particularly offensive blot on the preamble to add integrity, because it goes against the spirit of the whole people-centric spirit of the preamble. As far as secular and socialist, the other two concepts added, yes, it's somewhat superfluous. The secular part is superfluous. They also put it in the wrong place. I don't think that the I've read all of the transcripts during the drafting of the 42nd Amendment, and I don't think that they understood how to write a preamble, because instead of putting it into the descriptive part where these terms should go, they put it in the objectives part. It's not an objective to be secular, right? So the objectives part is not where you put those two concepts. They should have been put in the descriptive part. But since they didn't have the benefit in the 70s of reading my book, they were they were not able to.
Yeah, surely the introduction would have helped them a lot.
So I think, yeah, I mean, the 42nd Amendment, I'm not a fan of this, nor am I a fan of other inclusions like duties into, fundamental rights and duties. I find that extremely offensive. I mean, it goes against the entire process of fundamental rights that my individuality can flourish in a community, in a political community such as the state. But the state, as all states and organizations who have monopolies on violence and power, has a natural tendency to be oppressive. And consequently, safeguards are put up to prevent oppression by the state in the process of my submission to the state in order to flourish. Now, where in that formula is there any role for duties of the citizen to the state? That's a complete perversion of the entire idea of constitutional democracy. I understand that at the moral level, I have certain duties, and they may indeed be fundamental, but to inscribe them as into the Constitution, I find extremely troubling. So the 42nd Amendment is, that era is riddled with really bad, short-sighted decisions, I think, as our current one is. I mean, 101st Amendment is, as once again, shows no understanding of issues of social justice and the powers of the state.
Since we are discussing about secularism, and so building on the same question, recently a petition was filed in the Supreme Court by two advocates who they claim they want to form a political party, and they seek the removal of words secular and socialist from the preamble, and they claim that the Constitution cannot force citizens to be secular and socialist. And there are some specific provisions in the Representation of People's Act which there are some qualifications with respect to the parties and etc. So how valid do you think this argument is? And considering you have also mentioned Professor Neera Chandok, and I recently started reading Vision for a Nation, and the introduction I've written is very beautiful, and you've perfectly summarized Professor Chandok's essay, which states that secularism is central to the democracy, and the true opposite of secularism would be communalism and not religion.
Yes.
So in light of all this, do you think that argument is valid, that the Constitution, by having secular in the preamble to the Constitution, is the state forcing secularism on someone?
Yeah. So no, the argument is fallacious, but on the face of it, it's tenable. So let's talk about why, on the face of it, it's tenable. So I'll do just a very short recap of Neera Chandok's position, because I think she's the most important mind on secularism today, and secularism being such an important topic. We all need to gather around Neera and hear what she has to say on it. So her basic point is that we treat secularism as a value, and when you have a value, you laden it, you burden it with solving all kinds of problems that are even outside of its domain. So I can already, you and I are meeting for the first time here, but I can see that you're exceptionally bright and articulate. And so I know that you would be asked by friends, family, colleagues, students, whatever, to do far more work than you really want to do. Because people always see that, okay, this person has talent, is able to do something, and therefore, can you please fix my problems? I'm sure you've experienced that, right? Everybody wants you to fix their problems because
I'm too flattered by that.
yeah. So this is what happens when you find something that works. You start to add everything. You pile everything onto that, and the concept of secularism has been piled onto so much in India since the 1970s. And Chandok's argument is that what has happened in recent history is that this concept has, in the post-colonial movement, this idea of decolonizing the mind and post-colonial theory and so on, represented by people like Ashish Nandy, and he's the most, let's say, responsible of this group. It goes all the way to people like Bala Gangadhara from Ghent, Konrad Elst, these basic fascists who say that we have to get rid of secularism and have a Hindutva nation and so on. So there's a spectrum like that. Ashish is the most sincere and sort of authentic voice there. Neera's argument is that because of that spectrum, they all say that secularism is a way of regulating or controlling religion. And so you have this balance of secular versus religious. Neera's argument is we have equality between persons in our constitution as fundamental. Well, what do we do about religions? You have equality between persons, but persons in India belong to religious groups. So how do you have equality between groups? Equality between religious groups is simply referred to by the word secularism. And this is the most beautiful, simple explanation of what secularism is. It is the analog of equality between individuals at the level of religious communities. So your equality with me, my equality with you is referred to as equality, but you're possibly a Hindu, I'm a Buddhist, and the equality we experience as being parts of these religious groups, we refer to as secularism. So if you're not going to have equality between religious groups, that means you're going to have priority between religious groups, and that is communalism. So the opposite of secularism is not religion. The opposite of secularism is communalism, because all secularism is the precise analog between individual equality at the level of religious groups. This is Neera Chandok's argument in a nutshell. And I think it is 100% right, especially the part that we have burdened it to mean all sorts of other things, and this is a big problem. Now back then to the issue at hand. Prima facie, these people seem to be making a case because for them, secularism is a substantive phenomenon, just like I've been drinking this coffee here. I prefer coffee, maybe you prefer tea, let's just say. The state has no right to tell you to prefer coffee or me to prefer tea. These are, they're treating secularism as a choice, as a substance that we can choose between. Now, equality is not like that, is it? No one could come to the court and make a case that the state has no right to force me to be equal. That's a stupid claim, because the very meaning, legitimacy of the state, the very basic structure of the state, is that every citizen in India is equal. So you don't have an India unless you have equality, because you only have an India because of our basic law. And our basic law is predicated on equality, for Articles 14, 15, 16, 17. So no one can come in and say Article 14 or Article 16 violates the Constitution, right? They would be thrown out of court. Now, the people who come in and say secularism violates the Constitution, they should also be thrown out of court, because all secularism is equality between religious communities. And no one would be allowed to come in and say, you can't force me to treat other religious communities equal. Of course we can, because that is the very foundation of India. There is no India if we don't have that principle. So prima facie, it looks like they're making a case because we treat secularism as a substantive concept. It's not. It's a strictly procedural concept, just like equality. And so they seem to be making an argument, but in fact, it is as nonsense as it is to see secularism as being just another religion. You know, this is how we frame it. There are Hindus, there are Buddhists, and there are secularists. You know, and that's not how it works. That's called a category mistake in logic. So these people, I hope the judges tell them they're committing a category mistake, and please go and find something better to do with your time than to foment this kinds of agitation in our minds with nonsense like this.
Yeah, I guess Professor Chandok's argument about secularism being procedural, it's a new argument on the table. It's like, at least for me, I've never read about something, and it prima facie it appears that the people who go to the court claiming that secularism is an imposition of ideology on them, they certainly regard it as a substantive ideology which is being forced upon them, which it is not. So there are some changes which need to be made at the ground level. Moving ahead, sir, seeing as India is increasingly moving away from socialism, especially the current decade, we can say, the government is looking ever more ready to do away with the PSUs. So do you think in these times preamble can be used as a roadmap for policy formulation, or should preamble reflect the times, or should preamble be even amended ever in the first instance?
That's very fascinating. I never really put that together. Let's talk very briefly about this kinds of privatization of PSUs and what's behind it. Since about 30 years, the rise of globalization, not merely neoliberal ideology that kind of supports it, but the very practices, the trade treaties that we sign and negotiate and work around and so on, and the way that capital has flowed. Global capitalism has created a scenario where governments around the world, with very few exceptions, are incapable of living up to their original mandates. And the original mandates is basically to be a welfare state. So whether that welfare state is articulated as being socialist specifically, or whether that welfare state is articulated as just a byproduct of freedom, like the United States. So the United States is very much a welfare state, but they hate the word socialism. So they don't see welfare state and socialism as being the same thing, even though each of these contemporary crises, like about the postal service and healthcare and the pension, social security, these are all socialist concepts. So they don't articulate it like that. So the neutral territory is about the welfare state. In India, from the moment of its birth, this constitution is a welfare state constitution. So whether socialist or not. Now, due to global capitalism eroding the possibility of the state to perform its function as a welfare state, because I mean, we're bankrupt, right? Somehow, all of the world's nation states are bankrupt, and all of the world's corporations are richer than all of the world's nation states. Now, why is that? Because global capitalism has created a scenario where private corporations profit off of the economy, and the nation state has lost its sovereign capacity due to MNCs and tax loopholes and things like this to get a bite out of each of these transactions. So for about the last 15, 20 years, it has been clearer and clearer that India has no possibility of living up to its own mandate of being a welfare state. And for over this very same period of time, there has started to emanate from administrations, whether centrist ones like UPA or rightward-leaning ones, they started to emanate from these administrations that you need to start taking more care of yourself. The citizen needs to become more responsible. Ideas like austerity measures, all of these things have started to emanate. Now, one thing is that the idea of the welfare state emerges from the Constitution, and what we're finding today, I mean 2020, is the total impossibility of administration to effectively be a welfare state because they're completely bankrupt and have spent everything on military and crony capitalism and so on. So what's beginning to happen now is an attack on the very Constitution that demands the welfare state. So let's start rewriting this Constitution that is forcing us to be a welfare state so that we don't have to be a welfare state according to the Constitution. And consequently, we see so much talk about amending the Constitution, rewriting the Constitution, scrapping the Constitution. These are not abstract ideological ideas that come from nowhere. These are material created ideas. These are ideas that result from the era where we find ourselves, where the administration wants to subvert the Constitution so that it does not have to perform as a welfare state, which is mandated by the Constitution. So selling profitable PSUs, which is what, it's not about selling failed PSUs, right? It's about making PSUs fail and then selling them. Selling profitable PSUs, why on earth would this be done? This would be done because of a wholesale movement away from the paradigm of welfare and a rise in the paradigm of libertarianism. And you're going to see more and more and more and more books and articles and news reports and so on articulating libertarian ideas, like Tripadaman Singh's book on the First Amendment to the Constitution. This is nothing but a libertarian manifesto. And Tripur is a smart guy. He's not, I'm not saying he's, this is dumb or anything like that. He's very intelligent. And so it's just the way that the machinery is working now. We are in a moment where anything fundamentally welfare is going to be degraded and replaced by anything fundamentally libertarian. And it's not just a decision. This has been in the making for a long time, thanks to global capitalism. And so I don't think Modi's government is sinister. They do many sinister things, but it's not emerging just from a sinister endeavor. It's the pressure that global capitalism has put on the possibility of being a welfare state. It's not possible anymore.
So before we move on to the last question, since the talk is on preamble, we cannot conclude without giving a minute to the equality clause. The chapter in your book, you have given a statement, I quote from the book: "Nearly all of India's recorded civilizational history can be reorganized and rewritten as a millennia-long struggle for equality. End quote. To what extent this statement reflects the equality clause of the preamble? So, your argument is that since the beginning, it has been always a struggle for equality. You talked about graded inequality and other things. So,
This has a few. Unfortunately, this also has a few levels. I don't know if you've seen my book called Indian Political Theory, not Indian Political Thought, but a different book, Indian Political Theory. I published in 2017. You might enjoy that. It's also a cheap paperback edition. In this book, I try to reorient the way that we normally think. Now, you mentioned in your introduction to me that I taught at many universities in India, also in the US and Canada and Europe. And what I hear as I travel, if I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching in New York City or I'm teaching in New Delhi, I will hear the same thing, which is that words like equality are a Western concept. Americans will say it, we invented it and we spread it around the world. And Indians will say, well, the British brought this concept. Now, let's think about the 18th century where this claim originates. You get declarations, all men are created free and equal in rights, or by the French, or from the Americans, we hold these truths to be self-evident that men are endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So these declarations from the Americans and from the French stating that equality is fundamental to humanness. Now, the very first global event that happened after these two declarations from the Americans and the French was the Haitian uprising. So Haiti was a French slave colony producing sugar cane. And as soon as the Haitians heard that the French said all men are created free and equal, they said, oh, great, we're no longer slaves. And Haiti, is in the Caribbean, not far from the United States. So the first thing that the French did was not to say, yes, you are. The first thing they did was to send naval ships to crush the Haitian rebellion, to say, when we said all men are created equal, we meant us, not you. And the Americans, who made the very same declaration, looked at what the French were doing and they were saying, that's a good idea. We're going to send our army to help your navy to crush the Haitians, because we don't want our black slaves in America to think that these black people in Haiti are doing a good thing by rising up. So the two very states that we attribute this concept of equality as originating through their declarations were both states that defied the actual practice of it in the very process of articulating it. Now let's go to India. Put that whole history aside. In India, yes, it's true, we have not ideologically had widespread concepts of equality, like the declarations of France and America. But what have we had on the ground? On the ground, for millennia, we have had struggles, real struggles for equality. Struggles that have manifested from all the way back in early Buddhism to include women, not simply, it was a difficult task, into the Sangha, or to include outcasts into the Buddhist fold, rejecting Brahmanism that would not allow either non-Brahmins or women in. These were gestures of equality. And then we moved through our history up to through the 11th century, through the Bhakti movement and so on. We see on the ground, not a statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. Okay, we never did that. But on the ground, what we did constantly for the last 2,000 years was struggle for equality. So when we today, when you and I ask ourselves, Am I equal, and what does it mean? Which one do we think is the answer? Do people call me equal, or do I feel being equal? Obviously, the empty words make no difference. What matters to us, if we think about equality, is the results of a tangible, real struggle. So I'm sorry I gave that little compact history theory lesson, but here's what I'm trying to say. We have always said that equality was an idea that came from outside, but this is an empty and a pointless concept that really comes to us through a colonial mentality, because equality was an empty concept that meant nothing until colonies or post-colonies like India made it a real substantial phenomenon. And in 1950, in the Indian Constitution, this was one of the first times in all of global history that there was a unity between the theory of equality and the practice of equality, because it were not an empty words in the preamble that people are equal, but it was a real abolition of untouchability and universal suffrage and things like this. Now, why is this important? So if we understand that this is not if we reject the standard history, that the idea of equality comes from the West, and then we took it on because all of our freedom fighters were educated at Oxford and things like this. If we reject this standard history and we understand that what these words really mean is the sweat and blood that went into making them substantively real, then we see that when Dr. Ambedkar talks about equality in the preamble to the Indian Constitution, he is not mimicking that liberal idea that this is a foreign concept that we're just going to start to use. What he is doing is he is inscribing down that, yes, from the Buddha, who is my leader, my master, as Ambedkar says, from the Buddha to today, India has been on a long struggle for equality. And when I write the word equality as a fundamental linchpin of the Indian Constitution, this is the final culmination of 2 millennia of struggle for equality that India has always been on the road to realize. And finally, by writing equality into the preamble, we have unified this, this long quest for equality that has been there throughout Indian history. And so this is very important because it suggests that the preamble is not another false document like the American Declaration and the French Declaration. If a Haitian revolution arises in India, what would be true to the preamble is not to crush it. What would be true to the preamble is to support it. And that's what is special about the equality clause in the preamble. It is not a false, empty clause referring to a false colonial history. It is a real substantive clause referring to a real internal history. And so the equality clause in the Constitution represents 2,000 years of Indian history. It doesn't represent 2 centuries of borrowing from the French or the Americans.
So it is essentially the culmination of the 2,000 years of struggle.
I think that's what Ambedkar thought about it, yes.
So before we wrap it up, just one last question, since the discussion has been revolving around preamble and preambular concepts. Apart from your book, Ambedkar's Preamble, Secret History of the Constitution of India, can you refer to other readings, any book or any article which you think are insightful on this particular concept and the viewers of ELS Discourse must read?
On the preamble or the Constitution?
On the preamble.
Oh.
It's not particularly preamble because there is no not much literature particular to preamble involving preamble and preamble concepts.
Yeah. Oh, on the concepts. Oh, right. I'm sorry. Yes, you're talking about the preambular concepts. Yes. I think there are Gautam Bhatia's book. I think is a nice way of seeing some of the same issues from a more Nehruvian perspective than an Ambedkarite perspective.
The transformative constitution.
Yes, it goes over many of the same concepts, and of course it does it with reference to a lot of case law. So I think that it gets quite dense. The book gets quite dense, but if you can make it through the dense parts, I think this is a book that is really significant, because what I've sort of written is in Ambedkar's preamble is starting at 26 Jan 1950 and going backwards. And what Bhatia's book seems to me to do is to start at 26 Jan 1950 and go forwards. So I think this is something that I would recommend. Another book that I would like to recommend with great deal of caution. I have a review coming out next week of this book, and it's a very harsh review. But I still think that it should be read, and that is Tripadamani Singh's 16 Stormy Days. So 16 Stormy Days is mostly about the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, the reason that I think it's worth reading and the preambular concepts that it takes up is, or let me just state the part of Tripa's book that I like. He argues more or less that the preambular concepts, especially freedom, liberty, were so revolutionary that even the first cabinet could not cope with what they had done. And so the First Amendment was a way of already within a few months, putting the lid onto the Pandora's box of freedom that had been opened by the 26 Jan 1950 Constitution. And I really dislike. So first of all, it's kind of a right-leaning anti-Nehru rhetoric in the book, which I find very offensive. Really, no reason to keep attacking Nehru. He had his flaws, but he certainly had his accomplishments that that leave behind a legacy that shouldn't just be belittled because the current regime finds it acceptable. But so there's that part that I dislike very much. But more importantly, the more dangerous is that I think it seems to try to say that you left-leaning people, progressive people, keep blaming Modi and the current government for all kinds of infractions of our civil liberties and fundamental rights. But Nehru did it first. This seems to be the premise. So if you leave aside these two very dangerous kinds of ways of doing it, it's important because it talks about just how profound a liberty the Indian Constitution really did introduce. And I think we fail to recognize that, because the original draft introduced a liberty so profound and unprecedented, not only for South Asia, but for the world, right? Universal suffrage at that time was rare. It wasn't as common as it is today. So I would say Tripadamani Singh's book, because it really does amplify how profoundly radical the 1950 Constitution was, even though it sets that up in order to then blame Nehru and blame Ambedkar for reducing that radicalness through the First Amendment. And there, I think Tripa misrepresents history for ideological reasons, this right-wing libertarian kind of background that he has. But it is a well-written book, and it has a it should be read for the way it sheds light on how powerful this original constitution was in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and so on. So I would suggest those. One, fully positive. One, important to read, but you have to be careful.
Yes, adding on to what you said about attacking Ambedkar and Nehru on the First Amendment, I think this is book by Dr. Abhinav Chandrachud, Republic of Rhetoric. So the chapters in it have discussed quite well what were the circumstances and how the amendment was inevitable. So it's not really someone's fault, or you cannot really blame someone for doing it. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you
sir,
very
much. Please continue. Please continue. Sorry.
No. I was just going to. No. I was just saying that I enjoyed also his the other book.
It's a Republic of Religion.
No, there is another Chandrachud, right? Who's written a book on the Constitution last year.
The cases that India forgot.
Yes. Yeah.
The two
I thought that was
brothers.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh, are they brothers?
Yes.
Okay, and then I think their father was So
their father is currently Justice D.Y. Chandrachud.
Yeah. So this is a family.
I mean, he's currently judge of Supreme Court.
So these those are fairly good. I think they lack a little bit of the let's say the philosophical flavor and current that was going that was important at the time, like these Kantian references and so on, because they were trained strictly in law. But yes, those are definitely good correctives to these exaggerated presentations by So thank you very much, and I hope I have a tendency to go a little deep into answering some questions. I hope it wasn't too laborious for you and the listeners.
It was an honor to have you, sir. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.